They were already saying he would freeze before the new year, and the man was building 2 houses when he could barely afford the one. In the summer of 1884, in a hard little settlement called Coldwater Draw out on the Dakota plains, Amos Kell spent the warm months raising walls. Not one wall where a wall should be, though. He raised an outer shell of squared logs the way any man would, and then a hand's width inside it, a second full wall of planed plank, a whole cabin standing just within the first, and the narrow space between those 2 skins he sealed shut at top and bottom and filled with nothing at all. The whole draw laughed. Winter was coming the way it always came to that country, mean and early and long. And every other man for 20 miles was raising one honest, thick wall of solid logs and jinking it tight, and here was Amos Kell building a hollow box, a cabin inside a cabin with an empty gap between, like a man too poor to finish his own home. He would be a frozen corpse by the first hard blow, they said, with the cold pouring through both his foolish walls. What none of them knew, and what the killing winter would teach them, was that Amos Kell had read the cold better than any man in Coldwater Draw, and had built into that empty gap the one thing that would hold. He had come to that country carrying more grief than goods, only Amos Kell had carried his the long way round, off the water and inland. He had been a cooper and a ship's carpenter back east, a lean, close-mouthed man who had spent his working life fitting staves and planking hulls against the one enemy that never rested, which is the cold gray sea trying to get in. He had married late and married well, a quiet woman who sailed with him, and the winter before, coming down the coast in a hard season, the fever took her aboard ship. And they had buried her the only way you can bury anyone at sea. And something in Amos Kell went quiet after that and did not come loud again. He wanted no more of the water. He took what a lifetime of tools and passage had left him and went inland, as far from the sound of the sea as a man could get, and came onto a cheap quarter section at Coldwater Draw in the Dakota Territory in May, with a wagon, an ox, a chest of tools, and a way of thinking about walls that no other man in the draw would ever have guessed. For Amos Kell had spent his whole working life keeping the cold out of places it wanted badly to get into, and he had learned there the one plain fact the whole of his strange house would be built upon, which is that it is not the wood that keeps a man warm, nor the stone, nor the thickness of any solid wall. It is the still air. A cooper learns it fitting the double staves of an ice cask that must hold its chill through a summer. A ship's carpenter learns it in the dead space a good hull keeps between its planking and its ceiling, the layer of trapped air that holds the sea's cold off the hold. A single plank, however thick, lets the cold walk straight through it, because the cold moves through solid wood the way water moves down a wick. But trap a layer of air where it cannot stir, pin it still between 2 walls, top and bottom, so it cannot rise and cannot fall and cannot carry anything anywhere, and that motionless air becomes a thing the cold can hardly cross at all. It was the reason a bird lived through a blizzard on a bare branch by fluffing its feathers full of held air, the reason a storm window kept a parlor warm with a mere inch of trapped air behind the glass. Most men who worked with their hands had felt that truth and thought nothing of it. Amos Kell had thought a great deal. The idea was simple to say and hard to believe, and it was this. A cabin of one solid wall, however thick the logs, was a single skin of wood standing between the man inside and the killing cold, and the cold came straight on through that skin day and night. drawn out of the warm room and through the wood and away into the wind as fast as the fire could make it, so that a man had to burn cord after cord only to stay even. And the moment the fire failed, the wood gave up its heat, and the room went as bitter as the night. But a wall built of 2 skins with a sealed layer of still air held between them was a different thing entirely. The fire warmed the inner plank wall, and the warmth tried to cross the gap and could not, because the trapped air could not move to carry it, and the killing cold pressed at the outer log wall and tried to cross the other way, and could not, for the very same reason. The dead, motionless air in the space between the walls stood guard, letting almost nothing through in either direction, so that a small fire could hold the room while the great cold spent itself against the outer logs and got no farther than the empty gap. He would not be fighting the whole weight of a Dakota winter through one bleeding wall of wood. He would let a hand's width of trapped still air do the greater part of the work, and a small fire would only warm the rest. Where other men burned cord after cord, fighting the cold as it poured through a single skin, Amos Kell meant to hang a wall of unmoving air between himself and the winter, and let the cold break itself on nothing. It was, though he had never heard the words and never would, a dead air wall, a double wall of trapped still air, and he set out that May to build one on the open plain. He began, to the town's great amusement, by raising a cabin that looked at first like any other. Through May and into June, Amos Kell squared his logs and laid up a stout outer shell, a plain, honest cabin of solid timber, and the men who rode by nodded to see it, for that at least was sensible. Then he did the thing that turned the nods to laughter. Instead of chinking that shell tight and roofing it and moving in, he began to raise a second wall inside the first, a full inner cabin of plain plank standing a hand's width in from the log shell all the way around, its own 4 walls and its own low ceiling, so a man walking the space could pass between the 2 walls as between the sides of a narrow chest. When a neighbor asked him why in the world a man would build his house twice over when once was work enough, Amos said only that one wall let the cold through, and 2 walls with air between them did not, which was true, and the neighbor rode off shaking his head at a man who thought an empty gap was warmer than good, solid wood. All through June and into July he built his second wall, planing the inner planking smooth and fitting it close, setting it true and plumb a careful hand's width in from the logs, and leaving the gap open and empty, because the empty gap was the whole point. His one cabin became 2, one snug within the other, and the laughter grew with the second wall. The work of it was double, and it made the mockery worse, because from the road it looked like nothing but a man who could not stop building the same house over and over. Raising 2 full walls where every other man raised one is twice the timber and twice the labor, and Amos did it in the broad heat of the summer, the sweat cutting channels in the dust on his face. The plank pile shrinking as fast as he could plane it, and all the while the sensible thing lay right there in plain sight, chink the one good shell tight, roof it, and be done in half the time, and Amos Kell turned his back on the easy finish every day to raise a second wall around an empty space. A man who rode by once asked whether he did not know a hollow wall was a cold wall, that everybody packed a double wall with sawdust or straw or dry moss if they troubled to build one at all. And Amos Kell said that a packed wall was a fair wall, but a sealed wall of still air was a better one, that anything you stuffed in the gap gave the cold a bridge of solid stuff to creep across, while nothing at all gave it nothing. And the man rode off certain the widower had lost his reason along with his wife. That was the shape of the whole summer. Amos Kell knew exactly why he left the gap empty, and there was not another soul in the draw who could have told you. The laughter had a leader, and his name was Josiah Rourke. Rourke was a freighter, a prosperous, loud, broad-handed man who ran the ox teams that brought goods up from the railhead, held the big solid log storehouse at the head of the draw, and liked everyone to know that a man got on in this world by doing the plain thing well and wasting nothing. He had watched Amos Kell raise one good wall and grunted his approval. Then he had watched the man raise a second inside it and leave a gap of nothing between, and something in Josiah Rourke took it as a personal affront, as if the widower were making a mock of honest building itself. So Rourke led the laughter, and he did it with a freighter's carrying voice. He would stand in the wide door of his storehouse and watch Amos fit his second wall, and remark that here was a man so poor he had to build his house hollow, that Kell had put up 2 houses and would freeze in the crack between them, that a wall with nothing in it would keep out the cold about as well as a fishnet keeps out the rain. And the men would laugh, and Rourke would say the good Lord gave a man logs to build a wall, not to build 2 walls around a fistful of empty air. It went around the country. Amos Kell, the man with the hollow house, too broke to feel his own walls, who would freeze in the gap while sensible men lived behind good solid logs. Amos let them talk, because a laughing settlement is a settlement that leaves a man alone to work, and the work was long. When his 2 walls stood, he sealed the gap, and the sealing was the part that mattered most and that no one watching understood at all. He closed the top of the space between the walls tight with a fitted cap of plank, and closed the bottom tight against the sill. So the air caught in the gap was shut in on every side and could not stir. For Amos knew from a lifetime of casks and hulls that trapped air only keeps the cold out so long as it stays trapped, and still let it move. Let it rise warm on the inner side and fall cold on the outer and circle round, and it would carry the heat straight across and out, and the whole wall would be worth nothing. Still air was the ally, moving air was the enemy, and the difference between them was a tight seal at the top and bottom of the gap. He caulked every joint of the inner wall the way he would caulk a seam below the water line, so no draft could work in and set the trapped air moving. He fitted his low door double, an outer and an inner, with a still space between them. A little dead airlock a man passed through, coming in from the cold. He set a single small iron stove against the inner wall and laid in a modest rank of dry wood beside it. Nothing like the great cords the other men were splitting against the season, for his whole design was built to run on almost no fuel, and he knew it. The men who watched him seal up a wall full of nothing were sure now that grief had finished what poverty began. Josiah Rourke told it at the store that the widower had bottled up a wall full of air like it was cider, and would drink cold comfort from it come January, and folks came out on Sunday drives just to look at the queer double cabin where a fool had shut up the wind. What they were looking at and could not see was the finest part of the whole design. Every honest single-walled cabin in that country, however thick its logs, bled its warmth straight out through the solid wood all winter long, and had to be fed cordwood without pause. Amos Kell's dead air wall gave the warmth nowhere to cross. The still air in the gap stopped it on the inner side and stopped the cold on the outer side, and the fire's heat stayed in the room where he had made it. He had hung a hand's width of trapped, motionless air between himself and the whole Dakota winter, sealed it so it could not stir, doubled even the door against it, and left the cold with nothing solid to walk across. It was as complete a piece of cold country reasoning as the Territory had ever seen raised on the open plain, and the whole of Coldwater Draw drove out on Sundays to laugh at it. By the middle of October, the country began to turn, and Amos Kell got his first small proof, though he was the only man alive who saw it. A hard norther came down off the plains one night, the first real one of the season, the wind out of the north with an edge on it that furred the north sides of things with early frost and skimmed the water barrel with ice by dawn. Amos banked his small stove down to coals against it, rolled into his blankets, and let the norther blow. In the gray of the morning he rose and did a thing a ship's carpenter does by habit, which is to lay a bare, wet hand flat against a wall to feel where the cold is getting in. He laid his wet palm against the outer log shell, reaching into the gap, and the logs were furred white with frost on their inner face and cold as a stone in a creek, the killing chill sitting right there a hand's width away. Then he laid the same wet palm flat against the inner plank wall, the wall of the room he slept in, and it was dry and near to mild, no frost on it at all. Scarcely cooler than his own hand, the cold that gripped the outer logs stopped dead in the still air of the gap. He did not smile much, Amos Kell, not since the winter he had lost her, but he smiled at that. The dead air was doing exactly what he had spent his whole life watching it do. The outer wall was frozen. The inner wall was dry and mild. It was working. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who believes a true thing, and Amos Kell had lived in it all that summer, doubled now by the other loneliness he carried off the sea. On the hard, clear nights of that late autumn, with the first proof behind him and the great test still ahead, he would sit in the snug inner room with the little stove banked to almost nothing and go back over the whole of it in his mind, the way a man checks a sum he has staked his life on. There was no book for what he had built, not out here on the open plain. He had only what he had felt with his own hands in 100 casks and 100 hulls, the plain remembered fact of the still air that would not let the cold across, and on the cold nights that fact was the only voice in the whole of Coldwater Draw that agreed with him. Everyone he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing, that a man keeps warm behind thick solid logs and a roaring fire, and that Amos Kell had shut himself up in a hollow box. The quiet thing about the dead trapped air and the sealed gap and the two skins standing guard, only he believed. He had decided long before which of the two he would trust when they disagreed, and he trusted it now, and put another small stick on the coals and slept warm while the frost cracked the ground outside. He told no one, because there was no one who would have believed him, and Rourke would only have found a fresh jeer in it, and besides, Amos Kell did not need the settlement to agree with him before a thing was true. He built a little lean-to of plank against the north wall for his ox, so it too might break the wind, took in a shaggy stray dog that had attached itself to him over the summer, and settled in to wait for the winter he had spent 6 months getting ready for. The draw settled in too, its wood piles high, its opinion of Amos Kell fixed. He was the widower with the hollow house, who was too poor to fill his own walls, and had sealed up a fistful of wind and cut almost no wood, And when the first killing cold came, they expected, in the way people expect such things without quite wishing them, to find him frozen in the gap between his two foolish walls. The first killing cold came in the first week of December. And it did not come alone. It came as the front edge of the worst winter that country had seen in the memory of anyone living in it. A winter men in Dakota would still be measuring other winters against 40 years on. It began with a wind out of the northwest that dropped the temperature 50 degrees between noon and dark. And then it began to snow, and the snow did not stop. For 8 days the blizzard held the territory in its fist. The wind blew without pause, packing the snow into drifts that swallowed fences and buried the low sheds and cut Coldwater Draw off from the railhead and from everything but its own hard endurance. Cattle drifted before the wind and died against the drift lines by the score. A freight road that Josiah Rourke's own teams had worn into the plain vanished under the snow as if it had never been. The thermometer nailed to the wall of the settlement store, which the storekeeper watched with a kind of horror, fell and did not come back. It passed 20 below. It passed 30 below. It passed 40. On the fourth day of the storm, in the blue dark of a morning, when the wind seemed to reach down into the marrow of the world, the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass and read it at 57 degrees below zero. And he had never in his life seen it there, and he did not tell the few who were about because he did not think a number like that would help anyone bear it. 57 below. At such a cold, the ordinary rules of a frontier winter stopped applying, and a new and merciless arithmetic took over. Breath froze in a man's beard the instant it left him. Dry wood burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to give no heat at all against a cold that vast. The men of Coldwater Draw, who had built their honest, single-walled cabins of good solid logs like sensible men, found now what sensible men found in a winter like that one, that a single stove fighting 57 below through a single skin of wood is a losing fight, that solid logs, however thick, draw the heat straight out of a room and hand it to the wind faster than any man can throw wood at it. They kept their fires roaring and wore their coats indoors and watched their great woodpiles shrink with a growing private fear, and the storm did not stop, and the thermometer did not rise, and the wood burned down. On the open plain, in the queer double cabin the whole country had laughed at, Amos Kell was warm. He was not roasting, the little inner room was not hot, but it was warm, steadily and quietly and unmistakably warm, and it stayed warm through the first day of the storm, and the second and the third with almost no fire at all. For the hand's width of trapped, motionless air sealed in the wall was doing precisely the work he had built it to do. The killing cold sat in the outer log shell and could not cross the still air of the gap to reach the inner wall. The warmth of his small stove could not cross it to be lost to the outer shell, and between them the dead, sealed air held its ground and let almost nothing through. The wind that stripped the single-walled cabins of their heat could find nothing of Amos's warmth to strip. For his warmth was fenced behind a wall of air the wind could not stir. He kept a small fire banked low, feeding it a stick now and then, and it warmed the inner plank wall and dried the air, and the sealed gap did all the rest. He burned in a day what the men below burned in an hour, and the still-trapped air kept the cold off his inner wall as steadily on the third day of the storm as it had on the first. The storm gave him no reason to trust it and every reason to doubt, and still the dead air held. The wind found the open plain and threw itself at the outer log shell without pause. A solid pouring roar that went on so long the ear stopped hearing it as sound and began to feel it as pressure, and the snow drove so hard against the north wall that it packed a deep drift up the outer logs that only fenced the cold off the better. Amos Kell went out twice a day into that killing white, through the little dead airlock of his double door, to see to his ox and break the drift back, and each time the cold took the breath out of him like a blow and drove him back in within minutes, and each time he came back into a room that was simply, quietly warm, the trapped air holding the cold off as steadily on the fourth day as it had on the first. He fed the stove a stick when he thought of it, more from habit than need, and the sealed wall of still air did the true work, standing motionless between the warm room and the killing plain, while the world outside went to a cold no fire could have beaten through a single wall. He lay down at night with the dog against him and the storm screaming a hand's width away through two walls and a gap of dead air, and he was warm, and the wind could not get at the warmth. And hour after hour, day after day, the hollow wall did not fail. He had a thermometer of his own, a small one he had carried in off the sea and hung by the inner door, and on the fourth morning of the storm, the morning the store glass read 57 below, Amos Kell rose in the blue dark and stirred his little stove and looked at it. The needle inside his double-walled room stood at 43 degrees above zero. 43. Not warm as a summer parlor is warm, but warm as a ship's snug cabin is warm on a hard passage. Warm enough that his hands were sure, and his water stood liquid in the pail, and his dog slept stretched flat on the plank floor with no thought of cold at all. 43 degrees inside against 57 below outside, a gulf of 100 degrees held across two thin walls and a sealed hand's width of nothing but still air by one small fire in the worst blizzard the Territory had ever thrown. Amos Kell stood a while looking at the needle, and then he laid the flat of his hand against the inner wall the way he had that first frosty morning, and the plank was dry and mild under his palm, while a hand's width beyond it the outer logs stood at a cold that would kill a man in an hour, and he put another small stick on the coals and let the storm scream, because the dead air in the wall was doing the screaming cold no favors, and the room was warm, and it was working exactly as he had known 6 months before that it would. Down in the draw, the reckoning had come to Josiah Rourke. Rourke had cordwood, a great deal of it, a whole freighter's yard of it, and he had burned through the better part in 6 days of trying to hold his big solid storehouse against the cold. For a great room of thick single logs takes a great deal of feeding, and on the 7th day, with the storm still howling and the wood run low, and his stove for the first time going gray and cold at its heart, the loud, broad-handed man who had led all the laughing understood that he was in real danger, and that the nearest help in that white and screaming world was in the hollow house he had mocked. It cost him something to go. He waited until the cold in his own big rooms had a killing edge to it, and then he wrapped himself in every hide he owned and put his head down into the wind and fought his way down the buried draw to the widower's queer double cabin, half frozen. Not sure the man would even answer. Not sure a man could even be alive in a house, folks said, was mostly empty air. He beat on the outer door with a numb fist, and it opened, and he stepped into the little dead airlock between the two doors, and then the inner door opened, and warmth rolled up out of the hollow house into the storm like something solid. Rourke stood in the low doorway and could not speak at first, and it was not only the cold that stopped his mouth. He stepped through the double door onto the dry plank floor of Amos Kell's inner room and felt the warmth of it stand steady all around him. A living heat with no roaring stove anywhere in it. Only a small fire banked low against the inner wall, and he laid his own numb hand against that inner plank wall from long habit and found it dry and mild. And looked at the dog asleep and stretched flat on the warm floor, and at the little thermometer by the door reading 43 degrees while the world outside stood at 57 below. And Josiah Rourke, freighter, owner of the big solid storehouse, leader of all the mockery, understood at last what he had been laughing at all summer long. He was quiet a moment. Then he took off his frozen cap and said the only thing there was to say. "You put a wall of dead air between you and the cold," he said, slow, and it held. Amos Kell said that it had. Rourke stood on the warm floor a while longer, with the thawing coming painful into his hands, and said lower that he had been a fool about the hollow walls and about the man, and had said hard things in the door of his storehouse he had no business saying. Amos Kell, who had no more gloating in him than he had left of grief to spare, only told him to shut the inner door and sit by the stove and stop letting the warm out. He kept Josiah Rourke through the last day of the storm, and 2 others from the draw who came down the buried road behind Rourke once word of the warm, hollow house went round, and the small inner room built to hold 1 man, and a dog held 4 men, and the dog and the ox in the plank leaned to besides, and it stayed warm through all of it on almost no wood, because the heat was not in the fire. The heat was fenced behind a wall of air the cold could not cross, and the dead trapped air held it the way it had held it all along. When the wind finally broke on the 9th day and the sun came up hard and blinding over a white and ruined country, the men who came out of Amos Kell's hollow house walked out warm and whole into a draw that had lost cattle and sheds and very nearly some of its people, and they did not laugh about the hollow fool's box any more. Josiah Rourke least of all. He went home to his cold big storehouse and his burned-out woodpile a changed man, and in the spring, quietly, he came down to the double cabin and asked Amos Kell to show him how the walls were built, and Amos Kell showed him. Word of the warm house got around the country the way the laughter once had, only slower and more careful. Men rode over that next summer to see the 2 walls and the sealed gap and the double door with its little still space between the leaves, and Amos Kell, who had never much minded being laughed at, did not much mind being asked either. And he showed them the outer shell of logs and the inner wall of plank a hand's width thin and the empty sealed space between, and told them, in his short way, the thing he had known since the first ice cask he ever hooped, that it is not the wood that keeps the cold out, but the still air. That a hand's width of trapped air a man cannot see will beat a foot of solid log a man is proud of. So long as he seals it, so it cannot stir. A few built double walls like his. Most did not, because it was long, hard, strange work, and most men would rather raise one proud, thick wall they could point to than seal up a gap of nothing they had to take on faith, but the ones who built them blessed them. And the story of the winter of 1884, the winter of 57 below. When the widower in the hollow house stayed warm and the men who laughed came knocking, was told in Coldwater Draw for as long as there was a Coldwater Draw to tell it. They had called him a fool for building 2 walls around a fistful of empty air, while wiser men raised 1 honest wall of solid logs, and in a way the wiser men had looked the wiser, right up until the cold asked its real question. For a hard winter does not care how thick a wall stands or how high its woodpile is stacked. It asks only whether the idea will hold when the temperature falls far enough, and most ideas will not. Amos Kell had spent a whole summer answering that question before it was ever asked. Hanging a wall of dead still air between himself and the winter and sealing it tight so the cold could find nothing to walk across, and when the killing winter came and asked, his answer was already made, and it was warm, and it held, as the old ship's carpenters used to say. Of the still layer of trapped air that keeps the sea's chill off the hold long after the outer planking has gone cold, it is not the plank that keeps you, but the dead air behind it. Amos Kell had built his home around the dead air behind the plank, and on the morning it fell to 57 below, the still sealed wall of it never once let the cold come in.